In the unforgiving Badlands of Wyoming Territory, 1847, where the wind carved stories into Red Canyon walls and justice came at the end of a smoking barrel, 10-year-old Samuel Martinez pressed his small face against the frost-covered window of their isolated homestead. His breath fogged the glass as he watched his father, Diego Martinez, a weathered Mexican farmer who had built their life from dust and determination, stumble through the snow toward their rickety barn. The boy's dark eyes, wise beyond his years from witnessing too much hardship, noticed something different about his papa's gait tonight. Diego's shoulders, usually squared against the world's cruelties, now sagged under an invisible weight that seemed heavier than the winter storms that plagued their valley. Samuel had heard the whispered conversations between his parents, the worried glances, the hushed arguments that stopped whenever his bare feet creaked across the wooden floorboards. Something was coming for them, something that made his papa's weathered hands shake when he thought nobody was looking. The Martinez family had carved out their existence on this harsh stretch of land where the Powder River snaked through granite outcroppings and ancient pine forests, far from the nearest settlement of Bitter Creek, 20 miles south through treacherous mountain passes. Diego had chosen this isolation deliberately, seeking refuge from a past that haunted his dreams and cast long shadows across their simple life. He worked their small plot with the devotion of a man trying to outrun demons, growing corn and beans that barely sustained them through Wyoming's brutal winters. Tonight felt different, charged with the electricity that precedes lightning strikes. Samuel watched as his father emerged from the barn carrying something wrapped in oilcloth, his movements furtive and quick despite his obvious exhaustion. The package was small, no larger than a Bible, but the way Diego clutched it against his chest suggested it contained something far more valuable than scripture. Samuel's mother, Elena, stood in the kitchen doorway, her usually warm brown eyes filled with tears that caught the lamplight like scattered diamonds. She held their baby daughter, Rosa, close to her chest, rocking slightly as if the motion could somehow ward off whatever storm was approaching their fragile sanctuary. The wind howled through the gaps in their cabin walls, carrying with it the scent of approaching snow and something else, something that made the hair on Samuel's neck stand on end. It was the smell of horses, leather, and gunpowder, the unmistakable signature of men who lived by violence and died by the same code. Diego burst through the front door, his face pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, eyes wild with a fear that Samuel had never seen in his strong father's features. "Elena, pack only what we need," he whispered urgently, glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see armed shadows materializing from the darkness. "They've found us. We leave within the hour." But even as the words left his lips, both parents knew that escape was no longer possible. The thunderous sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the night air, growing louder with each passing second. Samuel counted at least 6 horses, maybe more, their riders invisible in the darkness but their intentions clear from the way they surrounded the homestead with military precision. Diego quickly extinguished the oil lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by the dying embers in their stone fireplace. He moved to a loose floorboard near the hearth and retrieved a well-oiled Colt revolver that Samuel had never known existed, checking the cylinder with practiced efficiency that spoke of a violent past his son could barely imagine. The riders stopped just outside the ring of light that would have spilled from their windows, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold air while their masters remained silent, patient as wolves circling wounded prey. Diego positioned himself at the front window, peering through a gap in the shutters while Elena gathered their children in the corner farthest from any potential gunfire. "Papa, who are those men?" Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind and his own racing heartbeat. Diego looked at his son with eyes that held 20 years of secrets, 20 years of running from a truth that had finally caught up with them in this remote corner of Wyoming territory. "Men from a life I thought I'd left behind, mijo," he said softly, using the Spanish endearment that always made Samuel feel safe, even now when safety seemed as distant as the stars barely visible through the storm clouds. "Men who believe I took something that belongs to them." Elena clutched baby Rosa tighter, her knuckles white against her daughter's pink blanket. "Diego, tell me you didn't bring that trouble here to our children," she pleaded, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would break her heart. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap, filled with the weight of confessions that came too late to matter. Finally, one of the riders called out, his voice carrying easily through the thin cabin walls despite the wind. "Diego Martinez, we know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and maybe your family lives through this night." The voice belonged to a man accustomed to having his words obeyed, someone who had issued similar ultimatums countless times before. Diego recognized that voice immediately, though he hadn't heard it in over a decade. It belonged to Jeremiah Blackwood, a man whose reputation for cruelty had spread across 3 territories, and whose pursuit of those who crossed him was as relentless as winter itself. Samuel pressed closer to his father, feeling the tremor that ran through Diego's body at the sound of that name being spoken aloud after so many years of silence. "What does he want, Papa?" Samuel asked, though part of him feared the answer more than the darkness surrounding their home. Diego knelt beside his son, his hands gripping the boy's shoulders with desperate intensity. "Samuel, listen to me very carefully. Whatever happens tonight, you take care of your mama and sister. You understand? You're the man of the house now." The words hit Samuel like physical blows, carrying implications that his young mind struggled to process but his heart understood all too well. Outside, Jeremiah Blackwood's patience was wearing thin, and the sound of rifle bolts being worked echoed through the night like the clicking of death's own machinery. "You've got 1 minute, Martinez," Blackwood shouted, his voice closer now, suggesting he had dismounted and was approaching on foot. "1 minute to come out and face what you owe, or we come in and settle accounts with everyone inside." Diego closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, Samuel saw his father had made a decision that would change everything. "Elena, take the children and go to the root cellar. Bar the door from inside and don't come out until dawn, no matter what you hear." But Elena Martinez had not survived 20 years of frontier life by being passive when her family faced danger. "I won't leave you to face this alone," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "We face this together or not at all." Diego looked at his wife with a love so profound it seemed to fill the dark cabin with warmth, and Samuel realized he was witnessing something sacred, a bond between his parents that transcended fear and death itself. "You have to live for them, Elena. Promise me." The baby began crying, as if sensing the tension that filled the air like smoke, and Elena rocked her gently while her tears fell onto Rose's blanket. Outside, Blackwood was counting down the seconds in a voice that promised violence and retribution. Time was running out faster than water through a broken dam, and Diego knew that his past had finally come to collect its due. "Your time's up, Martinez," Blackwood roared, and the sound of breaking glass announced that his men were no longer content to wait in the cold. Diego pushed his family toward the root cellar, but Samuel broke away from his mother's grasp and ran to his father's side. "Don't leave me, Papa," the boy whispered, his small hand gripping Diego's shirt with all the strength his terror could provide. The words hit Diego harder than any bullet ever could, and for a moment, the hardened man who had survived countless dangerous situations felt his resolve crumble like autumn leaves. He knelt and pulled his son close, breathing in the scent of innocence that would soon be lost forever. "I'm not leaving you, Mijo. I'm saving you. There's a difference, and someday you'll understand." Diego stood and walked toward the front door, his hand trembling as he reached for the wooden latch that had kept his family safe for so many nights, but would fail them when they needed it most. Samuel watched his father's shoulders straighten as he prepared to face his past, and the boy understood with crystal clarity that he was about to lose the most important person in his world. The farmer closed the door behind him, and his hands trembled as he stepped into the Wyoming night to meet his destiny. The confrontation that followed lasted less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes contained a lifetime of revelations. Through the root cellar's wooden slats, Samuel could hear voices raised in anger, accusations hurled like throwing knives, and the sound of old debts being called due. Jeremiah Blackwood's voice dominated the conversation, laying out crimes and betrayals that painted Diego Martinez not as the simple farmer Samuel had always known, but as someone far more complex and dangerous. 20 years ago, you rode with us?" Blackwood snarled, his words carrying across the frozen ground. 20 years ago, you helped us take that gold shipment from the Denver Pacific Railroad. $40,000 in gold coins, Diego. Enough to set a man up for life, if he was smart about it. Samuel pressed his ear against the cellar door, his young mind struggling to process the image of his gentle father as an outlaw, a train robber who had stolen enough money to buy half of Wyoming territory. I never took a penny of that gold, Diego replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. I rode away that night and never looked back. Built this life with my own 2 hands. Blackwood's laughter was like breaking glass, sharp and cutting. Maybe you didn't take the gold, but you sure as hell know where it ended up. Your partner, Miguel Sandoval, disappeared that same night with every coin. Funny thing is, before he died last month, he told us an interesting story about a map, Diego. A map he drew showing where he buried our gold. The truth hit Samuel like a physical blow, reordering everything he thought he knew about his family's past. His father hadn't been a simple farmer who chose isolation for peace. He'd been running from former partners in crime who believed he possessed the key to a fortune stolen decades ago. Elena's sharp intake of breath told Samuel that this revelation was news to her as well, that Diego had carried these secrets alone for 20 years, letting them poison his dreams and shadow every happy moment. Miguel's dead, Diego asked, and there was genuine sadness in his voice, the grief of a man learning he'd lost his last link to a youth he'd tried desperately to forget. Cancer got him in a Denver jail cell, Blackwood replied with cold satisfaction. But before he died, he made a deal. Told us about the map he'd drawn. Told us he'd given it to someone he trusted. Told us about a Mexican farmer in Wyoming territory who'd changed his name and tried to disappear. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity, and Samuel began to understand why his father had retrieved that small package from the barn. Why his hands had shaken as he'd held it against his chest like a sacred relic or a cursed artifact. You want the map, Diego said, his voice carrying no surprise, only resignation. You can have it. Just let my family go. But Jeremiah Blackwood hadn't ridden through a Wyoming blizzard to negotiate terms with a man he considered a thief and a traitor. Oh, we'll take the map, Blackwood said, his voice drawing closer to where Diego stood in the snow outside their cabin. But we've got another problem, don't we, Diego? You see, after Miguel died, word got out about that gold. Now we've got competition. Other folks looking for the same treasure, and they're not as reasonable as we are. Samuel heard the sound of a gun being cocked, and his blood turned to ice in his veins. Through the root cellar slats, he could see shapes moving in the darkness, men positioning themselves with the practiced efficiency of wolves preparing to strike. There's a bounty hunter named Cassidy who's been asking questions about you, Blackwood continued, his voice now holding a tone of mock conversationality that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier threats. And some federal marshals have been nosing around. Seems they never closed the case on that Denver Pacific job. Lot of people suddenly interested in Diego Martinez and what he might know. Elena grabbed Samuel's arm, her grip tight enough to bruise, as if she could somehow hold her family together through sheer force of will. Baby Rosa had stopped crying, perhaps sensing that silence meant survival in their current circumstances. You're saying I'm a dead man either way, Diego replied, and his voice held a calmness that Samuel would later recognize as the peace of a man who had accepted his fate. Maybe so, Blackwood agreed, but your family doesn't have to be. Give us the map and we ride out of here. They never have to know what really happened to you. The lie was so transparent that even Samuel could see through it, and he watched his father's silhouette straighten as Diego prepared to make the choice that would define the rest of their lives. The map's in the barn, Diego said finally, hidden in a tin box behind the hay bales. But I want your word that you'll leave them be. Blackwood's laughter filled the night air like the sound of crows cawing over a battlefield. My word? Diego, you always were too trusting. That's what got you into this mess in the first place. The gunshot that followed was so sudden and loud that Samuel's ears rang for several minutes afterward. Through the ringing, he could hear his mother's muffled scream. Elena's hand pressed against her mouth to stifle the sound that would have given away their hiding place. Samuel watched through the gaps in the cellar door as his father's body crumpled into the snow, dark blood spreading around him like spilled ink on white paper. But even as grief threatened to overwhelm him, Samuel noticed something strange. The men who had come to kill his father were now searching frantically through the barn, their voices raised in confusion and growing anger. "It's not here," one of them called out. "The box is empty except for some old letters." Blackwood's cursing filled the night air as he realized they had been outplayed by a dead man. Diego Martinez had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, and his final gambit was more sophisticated than any of his pursuers had anticipated. From his hiding place, Samuel watched as the outlaws tore apart everything his family owned, searching desperately for the map that would lead them to Miguel Sandoval's buried fortune. They ransacked the cabin, overturning furniture and ripping apart mattresses with the desperate fury of men who had traveled too far and risked too much to leave empty-handed. But Diego had been cleverer than they had given him credit for, and the map they sought was not hidden in any obvious place. As dawn began to break over the Wyoming Badlands, painting the snow pink and gold, Blackwood and his men finally admitted defeat. They mounted their horses and rode south toward Bitter Creek, leaving behind a destroyed homestead and a family forever changed by violence and betrayal. Elena emerged from the root cellar carrying baby Rosa, her face aged 10 years in a single night, while Samuel walked slowly toward his father's still form in the snow. The boy knelt beside Diego's body and saw something that the outlaws had missed in their haste to search for hidden treasure. Clutched in his father's frozen hand was a small piece of paper, folded so small it was barely visible against his palm. Samuel carefully pried his father's fingers open and retrieved the paper, unfolding it to reveal not a map, but a message written in his father's careful handwriting. "Samuel," the note read, "the truth is buried where we planted your first corn. Take care of your family. Be better than I was." Elena looked at the note over her son's shoulder, and together they walked to the small plot of land where Diego had taught Samuel to plant seeds 3 years earlier. There, beneath 2 feet of frozen earth and hidden inside a waterproof pouch, they found not gold, but something far more valuable. The real story of Diego Martinez and the choices that had led him to this remote corner of Wyoming territory. The documents told a tale of a young man caught up in desperate times, who had indeed ridden with Blackwood's gang but had never taken part in their most heinous crimes. The Denver Pacific robbery had been Miguel Sandoval's idea, but Diego had refused to participate, instead riding away into the night to build a new life far from the violence and corruption that had defined his youth. Miguel had drawn a map showing where he'd buried the stolen gold, but he had never shared its location with anyone, not even his closest friend. The map that Blackwood and his men sought so desperately had never existed except in Miguel's imagination and his dying words designed to buy himself a few extra weeks of life. But there was more in the pouch, documents that would change everything Samuel thought he knew about his family's situation. Among the papers was a deed showing that Diego Martinez owned not just their small homestead, but nearly 1,000 acres of Wyoming territory, land that had been purchased legally with money earned through years of careful saving and hard work. There was also a letter from a banker in Cheyenne, dated just 2 weeks earlier, informing Diego that the railroad was interested in purchasing a right-of-way through his property for the substantial sum of $15,000. Diego Martinez had not been a poor farmer barely scraping by. He had been a man of considerable means who chose to live simply while building a legacy for his children. The final document in the pouch was perhaps the most important of all. A letter from the territorial governor officially pardoning Diego Martinez for any crimes committed during his youth, based on testimony from several witnesses who swore that he had saved the life of a federal marshal during a bank robbery in Colorado Territory 15 years earlier. Diego had been a free man for over a decade, but fear and guilt had kept him trapped in a prison of his own making, always looking over his shoulder for enemies who no longer had any legal power to harm him. Samuel folded the documents carefully and looked at his mother, seeing in her eyes the same mixture of grief and determination that would define both their futures. "Papa was protecting us from ghosts," Elena said softly, understanding at last why her husband had chosen isolation over the prosperity that was rightfully theirs. He spent 20 years running from a past that had already forgiven him. But Samuel, wise beyond his 10 years from witnessing too much tragedy in a single night, saw something else in the papers that his mother had missed. Hidden among the legal documents was a hand-drawn map, not of buried treasure, but of something far more practical: the location of several natural springs and a vein of silver ore that Diego had discovered while exploring their property. His father had not been a simple farmer after all. He had been a man who understood that real wealth came not from stolen gold, but from the honest development of the resources that God had placed beneath their feet. As the sun climbed higher over the Wyoming Badlands, Samuel made a decision that would honor his father's memory while ensuring his family's future. He would not let Diego's sacrifice be meaningless, and he would not allow fear to trap them in the same prison of isolation that had defined his father's adult life. Using the deed and the railroad offer, Elena would be able to provide for her children while Samuel grew into the man his father had wanted him to become. But first, there was a more immediate concern. Jeremiah Blackwood and his men would not give up easily, and they would return when they realized they had been deceived. Samuel looked at the vast expanse of Wyoming territory spreading out beyond their small homestead and made a choice that would have made his father proud. He would not run from the past as Diego had done. Instead, he would face it head-on and ensure that his family's future was built on truth rather than fear. The boy who had whispered, "Don't leave me, Papa," in the darkness had grown into a young man who understood that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to live without the fears that haunted them. 3 days later, when Blackwood returned with twice as many men and murder in his heart, he found not a frightened family hiding from the truth, but a homestead occupied by territorial marshals who had been expecting his arrival. Samuel Martinez had ridden 20 miles through dangerous territory to reach the federal outpost at Bitter Creek, carrying with him not only his father's papers but also a detailed account of the events that had led to Diego's murder. The marshals who returned with him were men who had been hunting Jeremiah Blackwood for crimes committed across 3 territories, and Diego's death had finally given them the evidence they needed to bring the outlaw leader to justice. The gunfight that followed was brief but decisive, ending with Blackwood and 4 of his men lying dead in the same snow that had absorbed Diego Martinez's blood just days earlier. The surviving outlaws were taken to Cheyenne in chains, where they would face federal judges and territorial justice for decades of crimes that had finally caught up with them. Samuel stood beside his father's grave marker, a simple wooden cross that Elena had carved with Diego's name and the dates that bracketed a life defined by courage, redemption, and sacrifice. "I kept my promise, Papa," Samuel said quietly, his words carried away by the Wyoming wind. "I took care of Mama and Rosa, and I made sure the bad men couldn't hurt anyone else." Elena approached her son, baby Rosa sleeping peacefully in her arms, and together they looked out over the land that would provide for their future and honor Diego's memory. The railroad money would allow them to build a proper ranch house and hire hands to work the cattle operation that Samuel was already planning in his mind. The silver vein that Diego had discovered would provide additional income for years to come, ensuring that Rosa would receive the education and opportunities that frontier life usually denied to young women. But perhaps most importantly, the truth about Diego Martinez's past had finally set his family free from the prison of fear and secrecy that had defined their lives for so long. As winter gave way to spring in Wyoming territory, Samuel Martinez began the transformation from a frightened boy who begged his father not to leave him into a young man who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of those we cannot save while carrying forward the best parts of who they were. The whispered words, "Don't leave me, Papa," had been answered not with Diego's physical presence, but with his spiritual legacy. The understanding that true strength comes not from running from our past, but from facing our future with courage, honesty, and an unshakable commitment to protecting those we love. Diego Martinez's hands had trembled as he closed the door and walked into the Wyoming night to face his destiny. But his son's hands were steady as he built a new future on the foundation of his father's sacrifice and the truth that had finally set them all free.